Youth sport is $1 billion industry. Athletic development plays a significant role in that. I'm your host, Nathan Parnham, athletic development coach and author of The Sporting Parent. Here, I'll share my thoughts on youth athletic development. Welcome to The Get Down, a podcast for parents, coaches, and schools involved in the youth sporting landscape to help set your athletes or programs up for success. Before we get stuck into today's episode, I just want to give a huge thanks to our platinum sponsor, Play. Play is a global leader in high-performance fit-outs. I've worked with a team at Play for many years now, not only due to the quality of products, but because I fundamentally align with their vision to inspire human performance. From their industry-proven athletic flooring, Icon X racks, to their equipment line, they are a testament to what high performance is all about. Check them out at play.us or on social media to learn more, including our show notes for further information.
1, 2, 3, 4.
A big thanks to our guest episode sponsor, GymAware. GymAware is the #1 velocity-based training company in the market. They've been around for over 22 years and are deservingly synonymous with VBT. GymAware Flex, in particular, is greatly desired by high schools due to its modest price point, ease of use with youth athletes, and for me personally, in these environments, it suits multiple purposes, which I've highlighted in episode number 3, the necessity in choosing technology for that reason in the school setting. GymAware has an exclusive offer for listeners of the Get Down podcast, offering 5% off any individual Flex unit using the code GETDOWN5 at checkout.
1, 2, 3, 4.
I'm super excited to introduce our first guest in Series 2. We originally met when she was on an interview panel for a job that I was applying for. Fortunately for me, I got it. And over the years, I've been blessed to have worked beside her. It's enabled me to evolve as a coach and a person applying my trade and craft along the way. This particular guest was monumental in getting the Sporting Parent book off the ground. And she's been an absolute rock in many ways, both professionally and personally over the years. She's been involved in tennis for a long time as a former player, coach, then holding many roles, transitioning throughout her time at Tennis Australia, to now recently being appointed the Director of Tennis Australia's National Academy. This guest is none other than Nicole Kriz. I'm very excited about this one to share some incredible insights for you all along the way in the sport of tennis. So Nicole Kriz, you've recently been appointed as the Director for the National Tennis Academy within Tennis Australia. Can you give the listeners the extent of what that role looks like for tennis in Australia?
Well, hopefully good things for a start. It's a huge role and it's a huge privilege, and I feel like you have a huge sense of responsibility around it. From a macro level, it's really about the strategy and the philosophy of the NTA. So the NTA operates from 16 to 23 years old, and we're really going into a different stage. We've gone through COVID. We went through a restructure and then went into COVID. We did survive that, which was, the team did an unbelievable job of getting through that stage, and it wasn't easy for anyone throughout the world, that's for sure. And, particularly when you're at an academy that's traveling internationally for tournaments and competitions, that hit everyone, quite hard. So on the back of that, we've really settled now. The academy's kind of into its probably second phase and a second iteration of what the philosophy and the strategy looks like. So it's probably from a, overarching view. And then from a kind of daily operations, we're really looking at, what are the athletes doing? What are the staffing doing? Where are they going? And how do we best facilitate and, the team, and how do we make them as efficient as possible within their operation? So they're very high performing individuals. So my job is to really help them become the best version of themselves on a daily basis.
Yeah, great. And one of the things that I'm interested in, just a little off the cuff here, is You mentioned about obviously the impact that, we had going through a global pandemic a few years ago, and particularly for tennis, like there's almost like a hole in sport for that kind of 2-year period or whatnot for people competing in other sports I'm referring to. Have you noticed anything? Because tennis is a sport that, even from you're looking after from 16 years of age to 23, tennis is a sport that requires frequent travel and all those sort of things. Did you guys notice anything coming out of the pandemic as far as the, I suppose the ability of the players and that due to that lack of international competition at all?
Absolutely, Nathan. One of the biggest parts to that was the independence, learning how to travel internationally, which, from our junior, I guess from a junior perspective, you can have a pretty domestic dominant schedule up until 14. And then you start to really hit that international level if you're tracking towards, kind of that elite professional, level. And those athletes that we found that didn't travel when they were 12 and 13 internationally, the 08 was the year really that, they started to travel at 13, 14 for us. And it took them about a year and a half to get used to that international level. There is a bit of a gap between our domestic level and the international. What we found the earlier we can have them exposed to that, they're, they're understanding what that competition looks like and what that level looks like day in, day out. And it's only now that our 12-year-olds, so I think it was our 2010s this year, that benefited from traveling, as a 12-year-old compared to starting that journey at 13, 14. It's only those ones now that are probably getting up to that international mark that we're seeing that are, top 20, top 30 in the world. So that's probably the biggest thing. And then, as you know, what goes along with that is how to manage yourself when you're on the road. And as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, that's not easy to do. And so trying to learn, teach the kids that and have that learning embedded within their travel was a crucial thing that we had to focus on coming out of those years during COVID.
Yeah, they're great insights because as a coach myself, and often we're preoccupied with what we're trying to get out of the athlete, and particularly with tennis, with that international travel side of things, we often forget how young they actually start traveling. Which I want to go into that a little bit later with you because I'm really curious about that, and I know the listeners will be as well. But the thing that I think is really interesting about that fact is we're often, and I know you as a former coach, preoccupied with their performance, but their international travel at such a young age, that window that we're referring to when it came to the pandemic is essentially missed. So they're trying to play catch up, not necessarily, sure, there's a competition level of that international competition, but it's also their learning and their skill set that evolves as individuals and professionals to set them up long term. So, yeah, I think that's really great insights there. So I suppose you've come through the ranks over the years as a former player, eventuating into coaching and other facets within the game. How important is it, do you feel, for individuals who work within a sport to have some kind of experience playing or coaching of that sport?
It's a great question, Nathan. I think it goes both ways. Like, I think from an ex-player coming into coaching, you have insights and experiences that coaches, unless they've been at that level, they may not understand or may not be exposed to initially. However, you've got to develop the coaching side of that if you're coming in as an athlete and you've got some of those skill sets already. Conversely, if you're a coach that hasn't played at that level, then you have a responsibility to understand what that looks like, what that feels like. So if you can't talk to what it's like going out to centre court, Rod Laver Arena, first match of the Australian Open, then you need to bring on other people that can do that if you can't do that. And I think that's one of the things we try and be everything to everyone. And the more I've seen the younger coaches and even the older coaches go, all right, that's okay. I'm okay with not knowing everything. I don't need to know everything, but I'm going to pull the people in that do have the answers and have that knowledge. Because at the end of the day, the only person that hurts is the athlete. So whether it's you're talking about playing experience or there's a gap in your knowledge, it's essentially the same thing. You have a responsibility to the athlete to fill that gap and bring on the best in that capacity, and whatever that knowledge or field might be, whether that's S&C, whether that's nutrition, psych. So probably that, Nath, is how I would answer that. There's definitely benefits. I think when you get to that older international age, the management of the athlete on the road becomes slightly different, less about the coaching the specifics. It becomes more about keeping them happy, keeping them, engaged. Because as we know, tennis, you go out for 2.5 hours a day, 3-4 hours sometimes if you're playing a 5-setter for the guys. And there's a lot of time spent off the court there. And so it's really creating that environment off court as well that is going to engage the athlete and keep them in a great space. So it's probably different for different stages, but irrespective, you're going to have to bring that knowledge to the athlete if that's what they require at that time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know as a strength and conditioning coach, athletic development coach, whatever you want to call it, that it's for us working in different sports. I think the really good S&C coaches have an understanding that different sports have different cultures when it comes to the way they handle strength and conditioning, the way they handle, their philosophies and views and things like that that come with it. And so it's an interesting one because, I think if you were, say, for example, a strength and conditioning coach and you'd come from a rugby league background or, those contact sports where lifting weights was a big thing and a huge emphasis, and then you went into tennis and then, you tried to impose that lifting weights is the be all and end all to their success. Tennis is a little bit different. It's a lot more of a technical sport and they go about things a different way. And then throw in there the year-round travel, which, I haven't personally gone through it, but you've had an extensive amount of experience in doing that. It's exactly what you said. It's about managing what that actually looks like on the road. And I think as former players and things like that, you guys know this best, right? And particularly that's why a lot of those coaches, you end up seeing the journeyman coaches who essentially get on the circuit and they just stay on the circuit for years and years on end, because that essentially that's all they know in the end. But I can imagine that would be such a challenging time and process for athletes to not only train and get some good foundations to build off, but then also juggle those wins and losses, and then the flights and everything that come with that, and how you're getting there and preparing along the way. So that's something that I find incredibly fascinating, and I know the listeners will as well. So, and I think so for many of the listeners out there, they will have heard me talk about in various episodes the importance of adopting a multi-sport approach, and particularly in the formative years. Is this something that you agree with? And if so, how would it apply within the tennis setting? Because you've mentioned before that, 12 years of age, 14, they start to travel and start getting exposure with that. What's your thoughts on a multi-sport approach, and how would it look in the sport of tennis?
It's really important for longevity, for burnout, for injuries, for, learning different cognitive skills even. If you're talking about team versus individual, multi-sport approach, there's so many benefits of taking different things, different sports into your sport that you ended up choosing, whichever sport it is. We definitely do have that challenge in tennis because, as we know, there's a probably stigma trend that's been socialized that if from 4 or 5 years old that you need to have a racket in the hand and you need to select that sport. And I think particularly with a skill-based sport like tennis, we do get caught up in the trap that it becomes about volume, and the skills then we get caught up learning those skills within overcompensating to a certain extent of other strengths, other things that we can be learning, like others, what we do learn through other sports. So one of the things tennis has done is look at modifying the sport. So whether that's with balls, whether that's different sizes, different courts, different shapes, that's definitely one thing that's helped. And I think from an older perspective, from the NDS, so the National Development Squad, so that's our 12 to 15 kind of stage, we're really starting to see the private sector being incorporated still within the development. So really making sure that we're engaging the private coach along the journey and also within the schools as well. So not looking to necessarily remove kids from their school setting, so they're getting that balance within their sport. And PE, socializing, all those things do become important. When it comes to the pro side of it, it's definitely a lot harder, but that's where through our S&C, we do try and incorporate different sports, even through warm-ups, probably more so. And then on the weekends, playing a lot of the athletes playing golf, pickleball, paddle. There's a lot of things there that we are trying to tackle and solve the problem of really specializing. And I don't like the word specializing anyway, because how does a 4 or 5-year-old specialize? That's a really interesting word in itself. But moving away from that one sport at an early stage, I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, it's something that I've found fascinating, particularly. So you can pick a variety of different sports, and I was in the first inception of it was in the last Olympics, the Tokyo Olympics, and since I've seen it in that, I've also kind of gone down a bit of a rabbit hole in some of these young prodigies and things like that, and I've seen a lot of the, say for example, the skateboards and things like that. There's been so many evolutions and modifications of that to be able to get kids to do that, and throwing it back to tennis. So when you and I were kids, you were kind of, you either had a kid's tennis racket and then it basically just jumped straight to an adult racket. So I was using an adult racket when I was like 10 years of age and things like that. But now the rackets and things like that, and you've mentioned the different facets of the program within Tennis Australia being, court size, balls and things like that. And something that I think is actually really cool is I don't think that that's necessarily a thing about specialization. I also think it's about keeping kids engaged in the sport for longer because it allows them to that their self-perception and efficacy of being able to successfully hit a ball over the net and things like this and even making contact with the ball. So it increases the fun that's associated with tennis. And I think the modifications in various sports and things these days has been unreal. And I know that's a little bit off topic when it comes to the multi-sport approach, but something that I love about it is actually keeping the kids engaged in sports. And if you put the specialization aside when it comes to tennis, then those modifications and things increase the fun that they're having and then hopefully the longevity of them being in a sport to see it out the other end where they are intrinsically motivated and they can start to take that route if they want to take their competition seriously. And so I don't know about you, but is that kind of something that you found in the tennis landscape over the years has really been a conscious effort in Tennis Australia over the last 10 to 20 years of the evolution of programs in that development setting?
Absolutely, Nath. I think tennis, probably a little bit biased here, but tennis is one of the sports that did lead the way with modification. And the other Grand Slam nations, based in the UK and then USA, they did a really good job of marketing that and educating the parents as well. It's interesting because you couldn't agree more with the self-efficacy and the intrinsic motivation. I mean, we do know that this is, to the listeners out there, I don't know if they are aware of this, but Nathan is and was an exceptional tennis player. So I've witnessed this myself.
She's exaggerating there. She's exaggerating there, guys.
And it's no fun. It's no fun if you're playing tennis and hitting one ball and then there's no rally and you're going to pick up and you're spending more time picking up balls than actually playing the sport. So particularly when you're learning the sport, it doesn't matter. And that can be across all ages. There's a great clip. I think it's based out of the UK. It's one of the UK academies have done it. They had an orange ball competition and they posted on YouTube how many hits. There's so many hits on it and likes on it. But why it's kind of stayed with people is it's like a 25 ball rally that you could take that rally and add 12 years to that. These kids would have been, 8 years old, thereabouts. So add 12 years to that. And that's the exact rally that you're seeing at a pro level. Like the skills and what's needed from a physical, technical, tactical point of view and a psych, like that ability to concentrate at that level, receive and perceive, it was absolutely incredible. So there's a great argument for bringing the modified sports because it's going to be mapped to their developmental stage, not necessarily age, but developmental stage. And that's probably the only tricky thing if we're talking about modification is when you are moving through, through those stages, is it age dependent or is it skill dependent? And I think that's where we do get a little bit stuck coming into what's called the last stage green dot ball, which is 75% compression, moving into yellow ball, which is full compression, is at what stage do we do that? And there is almost a panic to get to that stage still, within tennis centers and within parents, because there's probably that misconception of the value of what we are learning through those modification sports and modifying those areas. So we do need to do a better job at that still.
And for the listeners, you've just mentioned the different weights and colors and whatnot of the balls. Can you give us a really quick rundown of what that actually looks like from the very beginning through to using a full scale ball, if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's blue stage, which is really first, that's really kind of prep. And that's, I couldn't tell you the diameters and the size of it, but it's the largest ball type you're using and it's a really soft ball. Then you go into a red ball, which is still larger than your typical tennis ball that you use. It's about 50% compression thereabouts, something like that. I need someone to tell me that and remind me of that. Then you go into an orange ball. So the red ball, sorry, is the tennis court becomes the size of one service box as well. So a quarter of the court that the kids need to cover. It goes into orange ball, which is that's in between the green dot and then the red ball. That becomes 3/4 of the court then, so played over the net. And then you go into green ball, which is your 75% compression, and that's played across the full tennis court. But still, the ball's still nicely bouncing in your zone. Like I don't mind the green dot ball myself. And I think if we're talking taking the ages out of it, if we're looking to keep adults in our sport as well, that's a great way to connect and keep them. You look at what pickleball's done or paddle, and the modification there essentially. And I think tennis can, and we are doing that within the adults as well to keep them engaged and still in our sport.
That's really, really cool insights, because one of the challenges with tennis is just simply being able to have a rally, right? You put it exceptionally well when you've said their stage of development, not necessarily their age. But I'm going to ask you there a general rule, or I suppose a window. What kind of ages are you looking at that would still be using that green ball?
Probably about 10.
You mentioned adults as well, but as far as that transition goes, is that kind of 10 to 12, or what does that look like?
So yeah, our Super Tens programs are starting to, like the national Super Tens programs are starting to move away from that green dot.
Okay. Do they use that green dot ball? And I'm showing my ignorance here, but do they use that green dot ball in tournaments as well?
They should be, yeah. If
Okay.
it's
Yep.
yeah, it
Okay.
depends on the tournament as well. It depends on the association.
Yeah,
So
sure.
absolutely, we are moving to orange ball team-based competitions. I think I'm sure will come up down in future conversations here, but that trying to engage our sport as a team-based sport younger, increase that fun, increase the team, increase the socialization compared to what can be a pretty brutal run of it later on when it's very individualized and
Yeah.
independent.
Okay. And so I suppose like tennis is a year-round sport, unlike many other sports that can tend to be more seasonal. So think summer, winter sports, and this leads many parents to believe that playing other sports simply isn't an option. I know we've delved a little bit into the multi-sport side of things. One of the reasons for it may be that a lot of parents perceive it to be, I suppose, lost time in comparison to their child's counterparts, or simply mastering the skills within tennis. So in the Sporting Parent book, I talk about that when it comes to parents. I refer to them in instances being essentially CEO parents. But the reason why I'm saying that is because there's an element of that specialization that comes into it. And along with the CEO parent is essentially us as adults being the adult mindset. So if we put our adult mindset hat on, that in order to get good at something, you just have to do that something. And I suppose when we talk about the specializing side of it, or specializing early, have you got any thoughts, I suppose, on how this can be adapted to cater to a multi-sport approach? So if we put like you've mentioned 12 years of age, they start kind of traveling and looking at those sort of things. Is it more the formative years, like under, and you also have highlighted too, which if anyone hasn't noticed this, if you watch tennis, you will actually often see in the background, even in warm-ups for, Grand Slams and things like that, that there may be, soccer balls, there may be other, AFL balls and things like that for the Australian listeners. And there's things in that. So when it comes to that, do you have guidelines, I suppose, or recommendations of them being able to engage in other sports in those earlier years? Is it kind of up until the ages of 10 where they should be playing other sports associated with playing tennis year round? Is that something that you think about?
Yeah, there's no hard and fast rule, but the recommendation is to keep a balanced program, daily training environment as often as you can, and incorporate where you can as often as you can. So whether that's warm-ups, whether that's in between, sessions to challenge them. If you're challenging a physical state, I'm probably talking more elite. I'll bring it back down to the ages for you and answer your question here. It's probably the 12 and under, definitely. For sure, take a modified approach as often and as possible. And that is definitely encouraged within the coaching environments and from a federation perspective. I've not heard a coach where I have heard other sports where, particularly around soccer, football, where coaches have said, you can't do that sport. You have to commit to this sport. And you're like, really? 10 or 12, really? Is that where we're at? And I can't speak to those sports. I'm sure they've got their reasons for it, but tennis is very much probably doing about 12 hours a week, up until 10, 12-ish, I think. I'd have to double check that with our long-term athlete development plans, but that makes a bit of sense. So therefore, there's a lot of room within the program, within the week, to bring in other sports. And again, I'm a huge fan of developing your capacity through other avenues that you can bring back into your sport that challenge that. And quite often, if you're doing tennis, there's a really good question about whether you're just getting better at the repetition of it versus actually developing the skill under pressure. And, I read somewhere, I can't remember where it was, but if you're going to do your times tables and stay on 3x3, 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 you're going to get better at it, but you're not going to grow your capacity at any other times table. So that's probably one analogy I would use here with tennis, is that it's a very skillful sport, but incorporates a lot of different skills over time. So it's not just, from an S&C point of view, it's from a cognitive point of view. You really have to be looking at how we're developing those skills, throughout the journey. And I don't think that can just be solved with one sport or doing more volume in that sport at that age. That cross collaboration, we do know the research does suggest that bringing in the cross collaboration, that you are going to be further down the track in embedding your skills under pressure. The more options you have, or the more environments you have at implementing those skills under pressure.
I suppose it's a bit like adding layers to it, right? So that you've got kind of different levels or different layers whereby these skill sets all eventually find their way, come to a certain road that in their library, you might call it, that as they start to advance into the more elite levels, these skill sets have been embedded and things like that over the years of accumulation in just the way they move on multiple planes and things like that too. So it's really cool insights. And the thing that I find challenging as well is, it does, like you've used football, soccer as an example, and it doesn't matter what the sport is part of the challenge that comes, and particularly in the youth, or I should say the actual earlier childhood setting, is when it comes to the privatization coaching and things like that. We had on our first guest, we had Darren Burgess talk about this in our first guest episode. And he highlighted too in saying that that's essentially these people's livelihoods as well. So I suppose part of the challenge, and this is why it is an interesting space, is that you've got people's livelihoods that depend on them playing year round to keep them coming back, or alternatively, setting them free and encouraging them to play other sports, while in the hope that if they do a good job as a coach and things like that, that the boys or girls will want to come back to that particular club or that particular sport. So I think it's certainly an interesting space, and there's no one size fits all model approach to it, because there's not only different layers for the athlete, but there's also different layers for us being practitioners in the space. So we've touched on this a little bit, and you mentioned it earlier on, and this is something that I'm really curious about, because I know you've had a former role that played a significant role within this in Tennis Australia. But so how is it when it comes to educating athletes to be independent learners throughout their journey? Why is it so important? And you've held roles that have been at the forefront of what that looks like in trying to set them up. We've mentioned the travel and things like that that comes with it. So what are some of the important attributes that separate those who travel successfully, eventually transitioning into the professional space, from those who simply just can't cross that barrier from local competition through to eventually making it as professionals?
I'd extend your point here, Nate, that what does it look like after their career as well? And if you take a step back a little bit to the privatization that you were just talking to, if your identity is really wrapped up in your sport from an early age, you've got your sporting career has a window of opportunity, and it is age specific. It's age related, and could be quite often careers are ending because of injury. So to me, we have a responsibility as a federation, and any sport does, that we are developing the person that they are going to be successful post career as well. We have a huge responsibility to do that, considering that a lot of the time that the athlete is spending through those formative years is within our sport. So, going back and narrowing an answer to your question there, Nate, some of the decision-making skills, that are important for life are also relative to what they're going to incur on court, whether that's how they're responding in those crucial, challenging moments, Or same thing, what are some of those skills that they're going to take from on court to off court in some of those challenging moments, whether it's talking about decisions around flights, travel, tournaments, injury, when am I coming back, relationships, coaching, who's in my coaching team. If we're not educating the person first, then it's going to come at a cost at the athlete, because the skills that you have off court are the same skills you walk on, on a sporting field, on the tennis court. It does not matter. And you can't just make those up either. So if you haven't developed those core skills, decision-making, self-regulation, or coping skills, if you haven't developed them and expose your athlete to them, or create an environment where they are going to be able to explore and develop those skills, then it's at an absolute detriment and cost to the person and the person they're going to be throughout their journey. What makes someone successful from a domestic to an international level? Probably the biggest thing is their identity and how much they're wrapped up. They're wrapping their individual identity to their sport, because if you don't have that balance of who am I as a person and I'm not just my results, you're going to have a very volatile career and a very difficult career, because when you're out in tennis, when you lose first round, you've got a whole week, you've got 6 more days quite often until you're playing again. That's a long time to be sitting on the sidelines. If there isn't more to us and more to our program, then yeah, it's gonna come crashing down for that athlete, that's for sure.
I think tennis is pretty unique. You've mentioned your coaching team, I think it was you referred to. So in the younger years, you can have your family around you, and you still see a lot of families around them and things when they're in the professional space too. But I think something that's crucial that comes from this, in what you're saying, in alignment with it, is that there's, up until a certain point, they can be wrapped and have all the decisions made for them. But if they're actually genuinely going to last as a player, as a professional, and as a career, then they need to be independent thinkers. They need to have their own, I suppose, values and what their own opinions are of their self-efficacy and their ability to tolerate certain things and adapt to things on the fly, because there's no other sport that requires such adaptation year round than tennis, because of the just simply the way that the competition and the immense level of travel is on an international scale. And this also coincides with, I love the fact that you said athlete identity, because we had a bonus episode on the podcast whereby Belinda Carpenter, who's the mum of Jeremy Carpenter and Ellie Carpenter, who plays in the Matildas, one of the things that she said was that she really drummed home with her children when they were children, in that it's really important for them to have their own identity, because what happens if that identity gets taken from them? So you've mentioned injury, you've mentioned results, and by having a firm set opinion, I suppose, and value of who you are as an individual, with hobbies and things along the way, then that really sets out that individual for success, knowing that, well, I'm just not so-and-so, the tennis player. Because once that tennis playing stops, you've essentially got the rest of your life that you need to play with. And that might be, 13 years of age, or it might be 20, 26 years of age. Then, and the longer that goes on and that identity is, then the more and more crucial that it is. So I think that's really incredible insights there for sure.
No, absolutely. And to your point around the interesting, I guess, nuances of tennis, it is. I mean, apart from musicians, these athletes are in a different country every single week. They have a different bed, different pillow, unless they're traveling with a pillow, different food, different language, different time zone. Like,
Sounds glamorous. I'm sure you've slept on a few floors over the years.
a few train stations as well. Yep, absolutely. Wrapping my arms around my luggage. Absolutely. And if you can't adapt as an individual, if you don't have those skills, and then you're expected to perform, like we're talking about our BJK Cup team who have just arrived from America. They've arrived a couple of days ago and are on the court, today. Like, if you don't have those abilities to adapt as an individual, you're not going to enjoy the sport. That's for sure.
Unreal. Well, Nicole, I know you're extremely busy in your schedule and there's a big week coming up, so I won't keep you any longer, but I just wanted to say a huge thanks. And to all the listeners, we're really appreciative of you taking the time out of your day and sharing these insights with all of us. So Nicole Kriz of Tennis Australia, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciative.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to GymAware, the #1 velocity-based training company on the market, for bringing you the guest episodes. Don't forget to check out their Flex devices with the link in the show notes and take advantage of the opportunity exclusive to the Get Down listeners, being 5% off Flex devices using the code GETDOWN5, being the number 5 at checkout. A big thanks once again to our platinum sponsor, the team at Play, for sponsoring the Get Down podcast. Be sure to visit play.us or our show notes for further information.
1, 2,